On 13th of April 2023, YouTube channel by the name of SunnyV2 with over 3 million subscribers put out a video that was originally titled "Why Chris Will Soon Be a Nightmare for Mr. Beast." Despite currently sitting at over 8 million views, this video is probably one of the worst things that I've seen this entire year. For those who haven't been following, the video covers what was at the time the recent transition of Chris Tyson, one of the hosts of the Mr. Beast show. Over the past couple of months, people noticed that Chris had made some changes to her appearance, such as growing out her hair, painting nails, and overall looking more feminine. It was clear that she was trying to transition, although at the time she wasn't yet out as a trans woman. She later on did reveal that she was undergoing hormone replacement therapy that has, in her words, saved her life. On top of that, Chris was looking happier and seemed to have a glow about her. There was a spark in her eyes that wasn't there before, but then enter SunnyV2, who claimed that this change with Chris was going to be a nightmare for Mr. Beast.
The Chris Tyson situation could become a complete disaster for Mr. Beast's brand. However, it may also provide some unique benefits. So let's begin by going over the drama.
Like, what drama? A person simply existing and finally being her true self? This video is literally the definition of making a mountain out of a molehill. It is edited very deceptively with ominous background music playing throughout. SunnyV2 goes on to speculate about Chris's private matters about her marriage, which I'm not even going to get into. In fact, I don't even want to bring this video up again because as of filming this, it's been a good couple months since all of this went down. But if you'd like a more in-depth analysis of this situation, I would recommend Kat Black's video. I think as a trans woman, she would be able to provide much more insight on this than me. SunnyV2 did receive quite a bit of backlash for this video, to the point Mr. Beast himself clapped back on Twitter. The video title was then changed to somewhat of a neutral title of "How will the Chris Tyson situation impact Mr. Beast?" Like I said, I don't want to get into this again because this is old news at this point, but there is this one bit of the video that stuck out to me.
While his co-workers expressed positivity, others weren't so welcoming. There goes a father figure the kid won't ever be able to look up to. Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. Weak man times.
Yeah. That is what I want to talk about. Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. This is a saying that pops up time and time again in the alt-right circles, especially among men. There is a book that you can get titled "Hard Times Create Strong Men" that comes with a warning label. Warning: do not read this if you're easily offended. Burn this book instead. Chapter 18. Rampant homosexuality. There is t-shirts, mugs, blanket throws, pillowcases with this saying. Joe Rogan, a man you may have heard of, host of the Joe Rogan Experience, which is one of the top podcasts in the world, is a huge proponent of this saying. On Joe Rogan's Instagram, where he posts such gems like, "The year is 2034. The Cash Me Outside girl is president. There are 67,298 genders. It's illegal to have a opinion. I'm the last straight male. This is my story." I swear this video is going to be the end of me. On 27th of November 2021, Joe Rogan makes a post on Instagram which is of a political compass with hard times on authoritarian left, strong men on authoritarian right, good times on libertarian right, and weak men on libertarian left, with the caption that reads, "We are in Kali Yuga, the age of conflict. All of the chaos we're seeing right now was predicted in Hinduism thousands of years ago. Civilizations move in predictable cycles, and we are in the lower left-hand square of the chart. Do your best to elevate yourself and the world around you from the madness that is in the air, but understand that this insanity is all a part of an infinite process."
You know, there's that old expression that hard times make hard men make easy times make soft men make hard times.
If you can't tell at this point, by weak or soft men, they really mean the LGBT community, the gays, the NBs, and of course, trans women, because they don't really see trans women as women. They see them as weak men who just want to paint their nails and act jesty. But here's the thing I don't get about Joe Rogan, because with this post and the caption where he is urging his followers to elevate themselves, he is clearly positioning himself as this authority, this hard man that is rising above all the madness of woke cancel culture or whatever. But like, what exactly are you doing that is hard? And don't get me wrong, I'm sure running one of the biggest podcasts in the world and being a public figure of his caliber can come with some difficulties, but as far as jobs go, he undoubtedly has one of the cushiest jobs on this planet. Even prior to his podcast, he's had a pretty good life, working as a stand-up comedian, UFC commentator, a C-list celebrity, and then eventually making his podcast his full-time job once it blew up. According to the caption of this post, where he claims we're currently in the lower left-hand square of the chart where the men living in this era are weak men, Joe Rogan living during this time, doesn't that also make him as one of those weak men? Also, the fact that he cites Hinduism as his source, even though it is one of the most LGBT inclusive religions that there is. There are a lot of gods, goddesses, deities in Hinduism that are said to be homosexual or the third gender. In fact, Hijra, which is like an umbrella term for transgender, gender non-conforming, intersex people, is legally recognized as the third gender in the Indian subcontinent, where these people have the same rights as anyone else. There has been some pushback recently, as back in March, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi came out opposing same-sex marriage, citing religion and tradition and etc., all that stuff that we've heard a million times before as his reasons. But the people were like, hang on, our religion is actually in favor of homosexuality, like some of our greatest gods and goddesses were LGBT. So the point is, Joe Rogan has no idea what he's talking about, which is nothing unusual, but the end of his caption where he claims it's some kind of a natural cycle that is part of an infinite process is a common theme among these ideas, which is that the Western civilization is under decay, the end is near, the civilization is on the verge of collapse. And when you ask them why that is, they'll usually point to some abstract reasons like moral degradation, hedonism, or, giving minority groups rights to exist. There are various renditions of this idea, this theory. There is Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition, Sigma Male Edits, TikTok at Go Woke Go Broke AU.
We are going backwards as a species. How do we go from this in the 90s to this today and call it progress?
I just realized there is so many Australians in this video. Sunny V2 is Australian. We have Go Woke Go Broke. On behalf of all Australians, I sincerely apologize. But this Calvin Klein photoshoot in the 90s with Kate Moss and Mark Wahlberg that Go Woke Go Broke seems to be so fond of, Kate Moss was 17 at the time of this photoshoot, yet they made her go topless and be in provocative positions with Mark Wahlberg, who at the time was 20, which understandably left her feeling vulnerable and exploited. And Mark Wahlberg at the time was charged for hate crimes where him and his friends tormented black kids while yelling racial slurs. But I guess you'd still rather prefer to live in a society with racists, where underage girls get sexually exploited, than fat people. Interesting. Sandman McTow on Twitter says, "Is this really happening?" Followed by an evolution of men from 1940s to predictions in 2040s, where every single man living in the 1940s were 1.88 meters or 6 foot tall, whose penis sizes would nearly double when erected, to 2040s, where we would have men that are 1.57 meters or 5 foot tall, with micro penises that are impossible to erect. Aren't you outraged yet? Masculinity is under crisis. The end is near. Except this image was taken from a porn fetish website of white men becoming weaker in order to submit to black men. So yeah, not the most accurate source. The late Gavin Samuels, who is often referred to as the father of the modern manosphere movement, who got popular through these call-in shows where he would bring in modern women, or more specifically black modern women, to humble them.
But a man earning the kind of money you're talking about does not go for an average looking woman.
I mean, my body is not average, so.
But ma'am, you please don't make me say it.
Say what? I really just wanted some advice. I love your.
I'm giving you advice, but you're not taking it. The advice is, ma'am, you're average looking at best.
He had a catchphrase, "Winter is coming," which he would bring up at least once in his streams.
Winter is coming. Winter is coming.
Obviously, it is a reference to the Game of Thrones, but for Gavin Samuels and the Manosphere, the winter referred to the end of times, collapse of civilization. It served as a warning to women that if they don't submit to men and give up on their independence, the world would end, the winter would take over, and as the infinite process continues, finally the men would be in charge. But not all conservative right-wingers are that open with their message. Like I said, for most of them, if you ask them what is causing this decay of civilization, they would usually refer to something vague and abstract like weak morality or a culture that doesn't believe in itself. Like, I'm pretty sure if you asked Joe Rogan who exactly is he talking about when he refers to the weak men in the lower left-hand square of the chart, I doubt he would outright say the gays or the transgenders, but there are some that do. Like feminist Camille Paglia, who straight up says that transgenders are destroying our society.
Historically, the movement toward androgyny occurs in late phases of culture. Okay, as a civilization is starting to unravel. Okay, and that you can find it again and again and again through history in the Greek art. Okay, you can see it happening. All of a sudden, okay, there's a kind of the sculptures of handsome nude young men athletes that used to be very robust. Okay, in the archaic period, suddenly began to seem like wet noodles. Okay, toward the end. Okay, and that the people who live in such periods, a late phase of culture, whether it's the Hellenistic era, whether it's the Roman Empire, whether it's the Mauve decade of Oscar Wilde in the 1890s, whether it's Weimar Germany, people who live at such times, okay, feel that they're very sophisticated, they're very cosmopolitan, okay, and homosexuality, heterosexuality, so what, anything goes, and so on. All right, but from the perspective of historical distance, okay, you can see that it's a culture that no longer believes in itself, okay, and then what you invariably get are people who are convinced of the power of heroic masculinity, okay, on the edges, whether they're the Vandals and the Huns, okay, or whether they're the barbarians of ISIS, okay, you see them, starting to mass on the outsides of the culture, and that's what we have right now. That there is a tremendous and rather terrifying disconnect between the infatuation with the transgender movement in our own culture and what's going on out there, okay, all right, and so I mean that's why I'm concerned. I feel it's ominous, okay. I question whether the transgender choice is indeed genuine in every single case.
Okay, so according to Paglia, civilizations become more accepting of the gays and the transgenders when it is on the verge of collapse. As our culture gets more and more beta, we've got alpha, masculine, giga chat from the outside looking to attack. Think ISIS. Think the White Walkers from the Game of Thrones. You know what? Let's just go back to that saying for the time being. Hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. Firstly, where does this saying come from? Despite how much these people seem to swear by this saying, there seems to be no clear answer as to who said this. I've seen some people refer to the founder of Dubai, Sheikh Rashid bin Said Al Maktoum, which, why are we listening to the founder of Dubai in the first place? That just seemed very random to me. The full quote allegedly said by Sheikh Rashid goes as follows. My grandfather rode a camel. My father rode a camel. I ride a Mercedes, my son rides a Land Rover, and my grandson is going to ride a Land Rover, but my great-grandson is going to have to ride a camel again. because hard times create strong men create easy times, blah blah blah. We've already heard this before. The post originated from Facebook, uploaded on 14th of April 2021 by My Property Consultants, alongside a picture of Sheikh Rashid staring at a distance. It went viral, reaching 2.3 million views and 1.4 thousand shares before it was removed. But does that hold truth? As in, did Sheikh Rashid even say that? Turns out, no. Apparently the first bit with his grandfather and father riding camel checks out, according to historian Graham Wilson, who specializes in prominent Middle Eastern figures like Sheikh Rashid, but the rest was never actually said by him. In fact, the image accompanying this quote is not even of him, it's of his son Sheikh Mohammed, who, by the way, did not say it either. Despite how much people like Jogan likes to claim that it is an old expression, the actual quote comes from 2016 novel Those Who Remain by G. Michael Hoff, where the protagonist Gordon Van Zold says on page 20, "I've lived a long time and seen a lot of shit. In my latter years, I have become somewhat of a philosopher, and this is one truth that is undisputable. Hard times create strong men create good times. Good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times." The novel explores a post-apocalyptic world where the United States is at war with Canada, which makes it fall under the genre of dystopia, science fiction, fiction. So this one quote that these people are basing their entire ideology on doesn't even originate from a real thing, as in there is no real life person who said this. They had to invent it, which is already a bad start in my opinion. But even if this quote isn't real, you can still argue that maybe the premise behind it is real. Maybe there is some infinite process where hard masculine rulers of civilization give rise to luxurious decadent time. The product of that decadent time create weak emasculated men who cause the collapse of the said civilization, causing hard difficult times. And the product of that hard difficult times create hard masculine men who go on to rule the civilization, and the cycle continues. Well, no. Turns out that is a very simplistic way to view history, and to explain that, we need to talk about Rome, or rather, the fall of Rome. If you ask these people for a historical example of this phenomenon, 9 times out of 10 they would point to the fall of Rome. Camille Paglia, for example, would constantly bring up ancient Roman Empire or European history in general to prove this theory. Now, before I get into this, I would say it straight up that unlike Paglia, I am not an academic, I am not a historian, I don't have any credentials on this topic. In fact, I didn't even know much about the fall of Rome up until researching for this video. But even with my very limited knowledge on the topic, I still ran into some issues. Firstly, Rome was a huge empire that lasted thousands of years. At its peak, it included territories in the modern-day Mediterranean, North Africa, Western Asia. During this time, it was ruled by various rulers, went through countless wars, famines, natural disasters. It's important to note that when people say the fall of Rome, what they usually mean is the fall of the Western Roman Empire, which happened on 476 AD, because the eastern half of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, went on to last another 1,000 years until it got hit by a giant cannon in the Constantinople. Sometimes the answer really is simple. Sometimes it's the simple and practical things like a giant cannon that can cause the fall of an empire, rather than something abstract like moral decadence or whatever. So condensing such a huge period of time, thousands of years, and all of the history that comes with it to such a small time frame where the empire supposedly fell is going to be difficult, to say the least. Another issue that I have with this theory is, if you can't tell already, it only pertains to the men of the civilization. It conveniently forgets that women and queer people existed back then too, so I guess the girls and the gays, y'all can have a seat and laugh it off. According to this theory, the hard men that were the products of the hard times, as in their rough and harsh conditions, made for morally pure and strong character, which made them good at fighting for some reason, and the weak men that resulted from decadent civilization with wealth and sophistication made them bad at fighting for some reason. The supposed weak and effeminate emperors of Rome like Caligula, Nero, and Domitian are often cited as examples of weak men that caused the collapse of Rome, except most of them only ruled up until 96 AD, and like I said, the western half of Rome fell on 476 AD. So if it really was the doing of these weak, effeminate, beta, soy boy, cuck emperors that caused the fall of Rome, it took over 200 years for that to take into effect. The point is, no one really knows for sure how the Rome fell or why it fell. This is something that is still being studied to this day. There are historians who dedicate their entire lives to studying about the fall of Rome, but whatever the reasons are, boiling it down to this saying, which really is like the live, love, love version for men, is grossly oversimplified and misleading. So if there already are so many counter-arguments that disprove this theory, why does it still exist? Where did this idea come from? Firstly, our historical bias comes into play regarding things like this. People are more likely to remember and fixate on these groups who broke the Roman frontier, classifying them as the hard men that were the product of their harsh conditions that defeated the weak men of the decadent Roman Empire, but tend to forget the rather long list of groups that the Romans defeated, all of which were the strong men of their hard times who were still defeated nevertheless. The thing is, throughout history, people like to focus on feel-good stories of underdogs rising up and taking down the powerful imperialist regimes than say the powerful imperialist regime obliterating a small village, which is what happened most of the time. But the trope of strong, hard men that were products of harsh conditions which also somehow made them good at fighting dates all the way back to 6th century BC, where Greek historian Herodotus wrote about Scythians, a group of nomadic people who lived in what is now southern Siberia. Herodotus wrote about the harsh, rough environment of Scythia and how the hard times in Scythia created hard, strong warriors that were skilled at fighting. In Herodotus' Book 4, he went on to say, "The Scythian race has in that matter which of all human affairs is of greatest import made the cleverest discovery that we know. I praise not the Scythians in all respects, but in this greatest matter they have so devised that none who attacks them can escape, and none can catch them if they desire not to be found." Except Herodotus never actually visited Scythia, so his knowledge about Scythian culture, customs, or even geography was inaccurate at best, but it doesn't matter because accuracy was never the point. Herodotus hyping up the Scythians as these hard, strong warriors, but then obliterating them in the Greco-Persian Wars and then the Battle of Histria was a tactic for the Greeks to establish themselves as a nation, to unify and define Greek identity that then became known for defeating all these so-called strong Scythian warriors. A similar tactic was employed by a man you may have heard of called Julius Caesar. In his commentaries on the Gallic War, Caesar builds up the tribes of Helvetians, Belgae, and Suebi as these hard, strong warriors. In particular about the Belgae, he went on to say, "Of all of these people, the Belgae are the strongest because they are the furthest from culture and civilization and least often visited by merchants, all things that tend to effeminate the spirit." Except Caesar defeated them, like absolutely obliterated them in the Gallic Wars, all of them. The Belgae were defeated in the Battle of the Sabines under his commands, Helvetians in the Battle of the Brebeck, and Suebi in the Battle of the Vosges. Now, Caesar was a lot of things. He was a general, statesman, dictator, but above all, he was a politician who wanted to gain power and have influence over people. So by building up Helvetians, Belgae, and Suebi as these strong, hard men, and then beating the shit out of these strong, hard men, Caesar was able to advance his military success and build himself up as a politician. But perhaps the most influential work of this trope comes from Roman historian Tacitus. In his book Germania, written in 98 CE, Tacitus goes on to describe the society and the customs of the Germanic people, region up the north of Rome consisting of what would be considered Germany, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Austria today, describing them as indigenous that have very little foreign blood introduced. He goes on to say how the peoples of Germany have never contaminated themselves by intermarriage with foreigners, but remain of pure blood, distinct and unlike any other nation. One result of this is that their physical characteristics, insofar as one can generalize about such a large population, are always the same: fierce-looking blue eyes, reddish hair, and big frames, which, however, can exert their strength only by means of violent effort, with their climate that has inured them to cold spells and the poverty of their soil to hunger. There are no deposits of silver or gold in Germany, since no one has prospected of them. The natives take less pleasure than most people do in possessing and handling these metals. They like old-fashioned coins because they have been long familiar with them. They also prefer silver to gold, not from any special liking for the metal, but because a quantity of silver coins is more convenient for buying ordinary cheap merchandise. There is nothing ostentatious about their equipment, only their shields are picked out in the colors of their choice. They bring back the bodies of the fallen even when a battle hangs in the balance. To throw away one's shield is the supreme disgrace, and the man who has thus dishonored himself is debarred from attendance at sacrifice or assembly. Many such survivors from the battlefield have ended their shame by hanging themselves. This work ended up being so influential that even as early as the 19th century, it was used to promote a certain ideology. For the Nazis, Tacitus's Germania was like the Bible, the golden booklet they called it. They used Tacitus's description of the Germanic people to rise to power. They used it to justify oppression and other atrocities they have committed. They even decorated the walls of the Nuremberg Nazi party halls with quotes from Germania. Even as early as 1943, Heinrich Himmler, who was one of the leading members of the Nazi Party, set out a mission where he dispatched troops to retrieve the oldest copy of Germania from some villa in Italy. They didn't find it, by the way, but that just goes to show how much power and influence this piece of text ended up having on people. But despite all the hype, there was still one small problem. Tacitus never actually visited Germania. He never traveled up the north even, and all the things that he wrote about in his book were sourced from word of mouth or his own imagination. He was literally sitting at his palace in Rome, fantasizing about hard German men. Rather, Tacitus wrote about Germanic people to criticize the decadent culture of Rome, to describe what he saw as moral decline. Yes, even as early as 98 CE, they were still speculating about the fall of civilization. Throughout Germania, he kept on comparing the Romans with Germans, framing the Germans as simple and humble, whereas the Romans were materialistic and superficial. Him constantly bringing up the pure bloodedness of Germanic people was a subtle dig at the decadent, hedonistic lifestyle of the Roman Empire, matching German virtues with Roman vices. I mean, he was correct in the sense that the civilization would decline eventually, but it took hundreds of years for it to happen. In fact, the year in which Tacitus wrote Germania was actually at the beginning of one of Rome's best centuries, with a string of 5 capable rulers referred by historians as the 5 good emperors, leading to the expansion of the empire, consolidation, perfecting its defenses. Many historians see it as a high point in human history, some even going as far as to claim that the human race was the most happy and prosperous during that time. So yeah, although the empire eventually declined, it was very slow from Tacitus's time, and even then, moral decadence is probably not to blame. But that doesn't excuse all the harm that Tacitus's work ended up doing, especially after it got under the hands of the Nazis. Germania ended up fueling Nazi propaganda to the point some historians like Christopher B. Krebs referred to it as the most dangerous book ever written. Now, as As stupid as this may be, I can still sort of excuse it given that it happened during the BC and CE times or the 19th century where they didn't really have the internet and access to the wide range of information that we do now, which can make you more gullible to propaganda. So why are people still falling for this now? I mean, we have so much information now debunking this idea, some of which isn't even hard to do. So why is this idea still prevalent today, to the point even some of the most well-recognized public figures swear by it? Well, the first and the obvious reason is social conservatism and racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, etc. all that comes with it. The idea that the gays, the transgenders, or queer people in general would lead to the downfall of civilization through attacking the traditional family is nothing new. Especially with the rise of fascist ideologies in the US, these sorts of ideas are gaining more prevalence. But on a more broader sense, a lot of men today feel threatened and question their role in current society where women and other minorities are gaining more rights. There are a lot of men, young men in particular, who are going through an existential crisis where they feel that their masculinity is under attack. This was described through a term coined by sociologist Michael Kimmel called aggrieved entitlement in his book Angry White Men. Terrible author, I know. Kimmel has been accused of sexual assault, but let's just focus on the theory and not the theorist for the time being. Kimmel describes aggrieved entitlement as a sense of entitlement that can no longer be assumed and that is unlikely to be fulfilled. There is an entire generation of men who feel cheated by the world, who were promised success and power, and thus they feel entitled to it. But instead of addressing the root cause, which is late capitalism that is forcing everybody to be wage slaves to survive, they instead decide to take it out on women, queer people, and other minorities. There is this psychological term called extinction burst that is relevant here. Extinction burst is a dramatic increase in behavior when reinforcement for that said behavior has been removed. For ages, decades, centuries, millenniums, men were able to get away with doing the bare minimum in society and yet be rewarded for it. But now, say with more and more women finally speaking out and standing up for themselves, it caused a lot of men to double down on their poor behavior. I mean, we've seen this in real time. As of writing this video, the Barbie movie came out just weeks ago, and men from all ages, all races, all across the world are still having a huge meltdown over it.
So, fantastic plastic feminist icon or sexist claptrap? With the movie's outrageously dismissive tagline, she is everything, he is just Ken. Has Barbie actually done a full 180? Is she now anti, not just Ken, but men?
This movie is not just a piece of shit. This movie is a flaming piece of dog piled atop an entire dumpster on fire, piled atop a landfill filled with dog shit.
If you're a man and you go watch the movie Barbie, you're 100% a beta.
Therefore, a lot of these men yearn for the past, where things were simpler, at least for them. As Kimmel further goes on to say, angry white men tend to feel their sense of aggrieved entitlement because of the past. They want to restore what they once had. Their entitlement is not aspirational, it's nostalgic. They want to refer back to the time where they held all the power. Through rejecting the modern times, they want to go back to being the hard men living in the good times. And that is what gravitates young men towards fascism. And I'm not exaggerating when I say fascism. In one of the most popular anti-fascist literature called Fascism, author Umberto Eco lists off some key features of fascism, with the second point literally being rejection of modernism. You know, reject modernity, embrace tradition, even though it literally goes against human nature. We as humans are meant to progress, to evolve, to change. We are supposed to be different. I mean, look around you. There are different trees, different animals, different insects. Why should we have to all be the same? We don't. We're not supposed to be like Tacitus's version of Germanic people with pure blood, fierce-looking blue eyes, reddish hair, and big frames. And likewise, not every man is meant to be ultra-masculine, strong, hard man. These sorts of ideas, this saying, this trope, is literally holding us back as a species. You know, I'm starting to think that maybe they were onto something when they decided to go with a quote from a work of fiction as their worldview. Because this simplistic, cyclical version of history is nothing but a fairy tale. It is a work of fiction. It is all fake. It is propaganda disguised as history. It's pseudo-history. And people like Herodotus, Tacitus, and Joe Rogan are able to tell this story from a place of privilege, where they get to have the back seat and look to the distance. But if you actually listen to the people involved, whether it be the Scythians, Germanic people, or even Kate Moss from that Calvin Klein photoshoot in the 90s, you will hear a completely different story. The one where they were not happy and prosperous, but rather quite miserable. And as for Chris Tyson, as of recently she went to Anthony Padilla's show where she was finally able to tell her story. Turns out Chris knew that she was trans since she was 6 years old. So this isn't some modern weak men times indoctrinating her. She has always been like this.
Did you have a moment when you first realized that the way that you identified with your gender was different than what was expected of you?
I was 6 years old. My sisters went to camp. My parents were in the living room. I told my parents that I was going to build a popsicle stick airplane in my room. And then I went to my sister's room and went in their closet and grabbed as much stuff as I can. And I locked my door and I turned on Arthur. And it was the episode where there was ballerinas and I just pretended to be a ballerina and danced around my room. And from that moment on, I was like, I don't know what this is, but I know I need to hide it, because I don't think the people, I don't remember exactly what made me hide it at such a young age, but I think it was just like, you know, growing up in that area, going to, you know, a very like very, very religious, well, all churches are religious, but this one was extra religious. Super religious.
Religious XXL?
Yeah, it was the premium.
During this year alone, there has been over 500 anti-trans bill that has been proposed in the US, with the following states where being trans is criminalized. During such a climate where being trans is so heavily politicized, Chris having the courage to come out and tell her story, to me, that is what being strong and hard is about. Because for Chris, the easier and the more socially convenient thing for her would have been to continue living as a man, yet she chose to be her authentic self. But there was still one more thing from Sunny V2's video that absolutely grinded my gears.
This was put forward in many comments supportive of Chris, who implied that there'll be millions of queer kids who look up to him, although this doesn't necessarily mean that it'll add any value to the videos. Mr. Beast has likely cultivated a massive LGBT audience, all of whom are already watching anyway, and if we've learned anything from Hollywood in recent years, it's that adding over-the-top LGBT characters for the sake of relatability rarely works as intended, and is often nothing more than a distraction from the premise of the movie or video.
I could make an entire video just on that one sentence alone. Firstly, who is Sunny V2 to say that Chris being trans wouldn't add any value to their videos? Yes, Mr. Beast may already have a queer audience, but now for those people especially, they're going to have somebody that they can relate to and feel represented by. If anything, given how politicized being trans has become, seeing a normal trans person on the screen who is just going about their day and living their life can add immense value. Because Chris hasn't really changed, she is still the same old Chris, just happier and overall better. On top of that, Chris isn't just some character that they've added for relatability or whatever. Mr. Beast is not Hollywood. While him and his crew may put on a performance for their videos, at the end of the day, these are real people with real lives that you're talking about. If anything, the backlash that Chris received just for being her true self caused a lot of people to side with her. People who did not even care about trans issues before are speaking up. A similar thing happened with me. For me, I was very naive and sheltered when it came to trans issues, partly because I don't live in the US, I live in Australia, like I mentioned, and grew up in a relatively progressive area where people are more chill about this kind of things. Obviously, being part of the LGBT community, I supported trans rights, but I was more so casual about it. It wasn't until last year when Matt Walsh came out with his documentary that is when I realized how bad things have truly gotten for trans people in the US, and I realized that if I don't speak up now, I would be siding with the fascists. I would be in the wrong side of history. Also because it's the right thing to do. You know, as said by French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, you don't fight fascism because you're going to win, you fight fascism because it is fascist. I think as a whole, we have moved past the stage now where you can reasonably argue with these people. In ContraPoints' most recent video, and by recent I mean it came out 3 months ago as of filming this, which you still need to go watch if you haven't already, The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling, she makes a joke about leaving the center, a spin-off of Dave Rubin's Why I Left the Left.
This podcast has pushed me over the edge. Centrism has gone too far and I am now pro-cancel culture.
It's in the description of the video, it's on the tweet where she promoted her video, and even though I know she meant it as a joke, there's still some truth to this. Your average US Republican now is a Nazi, and even if they're not open about it, they're likely to be using fascist Nazi talking points, and you don't try to argue and reason with a Nazi. But also, a lot of these arguments, talking points that they have are very emotive. Say with the whole hard times create strong men trope, this evokes nostalgia, a sense of power for these people, not reason and rationality. And you can't really reason somebody out of an argument that they didn't even reason themselves into. But I guess what you can do is inform people. Let them know where this trope comes from and how it was used throughout history. At best, you can cast some doubts and make them question their beliefs even the slightest bit, especially for the people who don't know anything better. So that's all from me for today, and as always, remember to stay hard.